Well, the Preakness is here. We have our draw. We have our 9-horse field, and it looks like it's going to be a very good race. A couple of really interesting handicaps here. And let's start with the 1-horse, Mugatu. Mugatu out of Blofeld, of course, owned and trained by Jeff Engler, which is a cool little wrinkle. Will be ridden by Joe Bravo. The morning line is putting him towards the end of the pack in terms of likely winners here. He is currently in the 20-1 range as far as an expectation. And if you want to know why, it's not a huge surprise. You look at the resume of Mugatu, and Mugatu, of course, wasn't also eligible for the Derby. We got to see him there live. He did a workout on the morning of the Derby, and he did that workout because they knew they weren't going to run him in the Derby. He did not make the field of 20. He was the first horse out of the mix. And as you look at his resume, he really has not come up with an especially impressive run to this point in his 3-year-old career. His only win came in a non-graded stakes. This was his break. He broke his maiden at Gulfstream Park back in November, and he's had a couple of questionable runs, including a rather unimpressive effort in the dirt and at the Bluegrass Stakes. And the 2024 Bluegrass Stakes, of course, produced Sierra Leone, who was your second place runner in the Kentucky Derby. And there were some very, very fine horses in there. The fact that Mugatu was not able to keep up with these other very strong contenders does not necessarily signify him being a likely factor in this race. That said, in a 9-horse field with a horse that has the pedigree and the price that Mugatu will have, he will without question be used in some of my exotics. I think third level in the trifecta is probably the right spot for him. And with that, we wish him the best of luck. The number 2 horse in the Preakness is a horse called Uncle Heavy. He is by Social Inclusion. Trained by Robert Reed Jr., ridden by Irad Ortiz Jr. Irad Ortiz, by the way, coming off of a very impressive weekend at Churchill Downs during the Kentucky Derby. He has his work cut out for him, though, if he thinks he can get Uncle Heavy into the mix here at the Preakness. Uncle Heavy, his last run, he came up 5th in the 2024 Wood Memorial. The Wood Memorial has turned out to be a less than impressive race in terms of some of the horses that came out of that. Resilience was the best runner in the Derby out of the Wood Memorial. Society Man and some of the other runners not really factors in the Kentucky Derby, suggesting that if Uncle Heavy could not hit the board in the Wood Memorial, he has a long way to go to hit the board in the Preakness with a much higher class field here. This, of course, a Grade 1 stakes. That said, he is a price. The morning line was set for Uncle Heavy at 22-1. That's not crazy. And ultimately, he is not an especially fast horse, which makes him an intriguing horse to use in exotics. So he is going to be off the pace. He's going to stalk. And what really interests me the most about Uncle Heavy's resume, he's got some wins. He won in the dirt, in the mud at the Withers Grade 3 at Aqueduct back in February. In fact, that was the most impressive run of his career, from what I can tell you, in terms of the horses he was up against and the speed figure he put together on a muddy track. So definitely follow the weather reports. If it looks like it's going to be a muddy track or an off track in Baltimore on Saturday, Uncle Heavy has got to be in your exotics, although do not think he has the quality to hit the top of the board. He could very well finish in the top 3. The 3-horse in the Preakness Stakes is Catching Freedom. That is a familiar name, likely to you, because Catching Freedom was a very popular horse that many people picked to win the Kentucky Derby. He ultimately finished 4th, catching a beautiful ride behind Mystik Dan for the majority of the race. Ultimately did not have enough of a kick to catch Mystik Dan down the home stretch. And really, that begs the question about whether or not he is going to be a factor for the Preakness. He is, of course, trained by Brad Cox. He is ridden by Flavian Pratt. And while he is very impressive in terms of his workmanlike attitude, and while Brad Cox clearly knows this horse well enough to know that in 2 weeks rest, he will be back into top form, I have questions about him going up against more well-rested horses like the Baffords in this race. And so for those reasons, he is probably not going to be big on my card for Saturday. That said, the Louisiana Derby and really the horses that came through Louisiana on their way to the Preakness have proven to be quite good. And so if you think that he can replicate the type of run that we saw at the Louisiana Derby, where he closed on the field with authority, ultimately holding on to beat Anna Marie, then yes, he is very much a factor in this race. looking at the morning line price in the 6-1 range, I can predict pretty likely that that will be bet. I do not think that Catching Freedom will go off in the 6-1 range. He, in my opinion, is going to go off as your third choice for this race, probably around 4-1. Will he catch Mystik Dan in terms of price? Probably not. A lot of people expecting Mystik Dan to back up his amazing Kentucky Derby run, but Catching Freedom is going to be absolutely in the mix among a lot of players at the top of their tickets for the Preakness on Saturday. The number 4 horse is the heavy favorite for the Preakness on Saturday, and it is Muth. And Muth, if you have not seen him run a race, is a spectacular thoroughbred. Muth is your Arkansas Derby champion. Arkansas Derby, of course, included Mystik Dan. And you might ask yourself, well, if he won the Arkansas Derby, if he beat Mystik Dan, if he beat Just Steel, why didn't he run in the Derby? Well, the suspension for his trainer, Bob Baffert, prevented Muth from being eligible to run at Churchill Downs. And so this is the first time since his Arkansas Derby win that we will see him take the racetrack. And if you rewatch the Derby, it was incredible. The Arkansas Derby, it was truly a very, very impressive run out of Muth. He put together a speed factor that topped what we saw from the Kentucky Derby winner, Mystik Dan, even with Mystik Dan catching a golden rail in that run. And so it is very clear and expected that Muth will go off as a heavy favorite in this race. He is currently in the 8-5 range. He will be ridden by Juan Hernandez. And while I think 8-5 is probably fair value, I am mostly interested to see how short he gets by the time this race gets to the wire. And so Muth in the 8-5 range, a must use, a top of the ticket, a single, in fact, in any of the exotics. However, if it gets into the, somewhere in the 1-1 or even shorter, 4-5, then it's going to be tough to do anything with this horse besides put him at the top of some exotics and hope that you catch a price underneath, because ultimately Muth is the best in class that I can tell you in this field. He is trained by one of the most successful trainers, particularly at this racetrack, in Bob Baffert, and he absolutely looks the part to be your 2024 Preakness champion. The 5th horse drawn into the Preakness Stakes is your Kentucky Derby champion, Mystik Dan. Mystik Dan, of course, your 17-1 winner on the first Saturday in May, is trained by Kenny McPeek, and he will be ridden again by Brian Hernandez Jr. This duo pulled off the almost impossible Oaks Derby double on the first weekend in May, and couldn't be happier for what has been an outstanding team getting Mystik Dan into the winner's circle. This is going to be as tough, if not a tougher test, however, as he draws a horse who beat him soundly in the Arkansas Derby with Muth by Bob Baffert. And I look at Mystik Dan's chances, and I think he is going to need the ride of his life to back up what was already the ride of his life. And that is because Muth has drawn inside at the 4. Mystik Dan wants to be on the rail. His 2 best runs in his life came on the rail. And realistically, Muth will likely beat him to pole position, will likely dictate the pace early going in this race. Mystik Dan being able to create enough of a closing effort to pass Muth down the home stretch here feels unlikely to me. And given the current price of 5-2, as fun as it would be to see a horse realistically chase the Triple Crown this year, and as great a story as both Mystik Dan's run in the Derby, as well as the excellent job done by Kenny McPeek and Brian Hernandez Jr. has been, I think at price morning line 5-2, this is going to be a horse that gets a pass for me. I think I'll ultimately expect him to be a factor on the summer circuit, depending on where they take him to run. And I think ultimately this Mystik Dan story will likely be revisited once we get to the Breeders' Cup and he maybe makes a run at the Breeders' Cup Classic or maybe the Breeders' Cup Mile. However, I think the Preakness is going to be a little bit difficult for him to back up on a 2-week turnaround, considering he's going up against the very fresh and the very formidable Muth. Best of luck to Mystik Dan in chasing your Triple Crown dream, but I think he will be a pass for me, particularly at price. The 6th horse drawn into the Kentucky Derby is a horse called Seize the Gray. Seize the Gray, sired by Arrowgate. We have an Arrowgate sired horse in this race, trained by D. Wayne Lucas, ridden by Jamie Torres. And if you look at your programs, you look at your past performances, you will note Seize the Gray won his last race, and it was the first Saturday in May, and it was in Churchill Downs. It was not the Kentucky Derby. It was the Pat Day Mile, which was a grade 2 stakes race on Derby Day. And honestly, he went off a little bit of a long shot in that race and ran a phenomenally impressive mile. I think the fact that this is the shortest of the Triple Crown efforts at the Preakness favors him having a realistic chance to be on or near the lead here. And at his current price point of 15 to 1, there's definitely room to consider him to be a factor. I think being drawn outside of Muth and Mystik Dan, who are your likely early speed horses in this race, is probably pretty good for Seize the Gray, who likes to run on the lead. Now, whether or not he can consistently put up the type of speed we saw from him in the Pat Day Mile and carry it to the mile and 3/16 here at the Preakness is a tougher question. Ultimately, I think he probably fades down the stretch as this is a little bit longer than the horse realistically wants to run. And if he is fading off of the lead, he will be a toss for me in terms of considering him in the exotics. That said, beautiful price point, incredible pedigree, and Dwayne Lucas surely knows how to put together a show-stopping bid for an upset. And so I will have my mind open and look and read and hear the reports of how Seize the Gray is looking in preparations in Baltimore. But for me, at this point, he will be a toss. The 7 horse in this race is Just Steel, sired by Justify. This is another Dean Wade and Lucas horse, and it will be ridden by Joel Rosario at the Preakness. Now, the Kentucky Derby was not an especially impressive showing for Just Steel. He ended up in 17th out of 20 horses running, and the reason was he was a surprising pace setter in that race. There was nothing in the past performances that really indicated that Just Steel was the type of horse that wanted to be on the lead and that wanted to set the pace. And while we had relatively fast early fraction at the first quarter mile, the half mile was not especially fast, and then Just Steel had a ton of difficulty around the final turn and coming down the home stretch, keeping up with the rest of the pack. That said, he has run a lot of races for Dwayne Lucas. Dwayne Lucas really knows how to get a horse prepped for a given race. And the fact that he has brought him here on 2 weeks rest and believes that he can be a factor is enough for me to kind of consider him carefully. At 15 to 1 morning line price, he will likely be a toss for me. But this horse tends to run whatever race he is being given an opportunity to on a given day, and the Kentucky Derby feels like an exception as you look back through his past performances. So I will give him the benefit of the doubt and think that this might be a decent time to buy low on Just Steel. However, using him beyond your show or place is probably asking him for too much. So he will be on a lower portion of my exotics for the Preakness as opposed to at the top. The number 8 horse in the Preakness is a horse called Tuscan Gold out of Maglia de Oro, trained by Chad Brown, ridden by Tyler Gaffalione. That is, of course, the combination that took Sierra Leone to the second place finish at the Kentucky Derby 2 weeks ago. Tuscan Gold is a relatively lightly raced horse. Last run was the Louisiana Derby, where he finished 3rd. That was a very impressive race, ultimately. We know Catching Freedom is a good horse. Catching Freedom won that Louisiana Derby and is here in this race. We know Honor Marie is a good horse. Honor Marie finished 2nd in that race and ran fairly well at the Derby outside of a very poor break. Tuscan Gold, on the other hand, is in the progression stage of his career, learning how to run as a 3-year-old. And for those reasons, this is going to be a very popular horse as we head into the weekend. Right now, the morning line for Tuscan Gold is 8 to 1. The fact that Chad Brown is involved and has brought this horse, pointed him at this race, is noteworthy because Chad Brown certainly knows his horses, knows what distances they want, and definitely had a mind after the Louisiana Derby that this was a horse that could be a spoiler for the Preakness. And if you have not heard this before, Chad Brown certainly knows how to spoil Triple Crown effort. He has absolutely played the role of villain when it comes to bringing a horse specifically into this race who we think is positioned well, or at least timed well in terms of progression. And Tuscan Gold has all of those fingerprints. And so I will absolutely be using Tuscan Gold among the choices to win the Preakness in my exotics. I think of all of the horses in this field, he is my second favorite after Muth. And so an exacta of 4/8, I think, is in the mix here. Tuscan Gold could be the spoiler that ruins Muth's day and Bob Baffert's day as well, particularly if that contingent of Baffert horses goes out too fast here. But Tuscan Gold with a bit of a stalking tendency and a race that we have not seen this horse run its best race this spring, as far as I can tell you. All signs to look for Tuscan Gold to have a big Saturday at Pimlico Racetrack. The ninth horse in our 9-horse field is Imagination. Imagination will be shipping out from California. He is trained by Bob Baffert, ridden by Frankie Dettori. This Into Mischief colt has put together some impressive races so far in 2024. He has a first graded stakes win on his card in the early portion of March, where he won the 2024 San Felipe Stakes. It was a grade 2 stakes. There were some good horses in that field, and Imagination put up a very impressive speed figure in that race in Santa Anita. He backed that up with a very impressive running in the Santa Anita Derby, and what made that running so impressive was that Stronghold just found a way to eke out Imagination in that Derby. And Stronghold, I thought, ran a very competitive Kentucky Derby, which gives you the sense that if Imagination and Stronghold are similarly quality horses, then Imagination is going to be able to be at or near the lead here at the Preakness Stakes. And with a shorter distance than the Kentucky Derby, he might have enough to ultimately be a factor in terms of deciding the winner here. Again, there are 2 Bob Baffert horses in this field, our favorite Muth and Imagination. And I can tell you that one of the most popular bets among all of the exotics is going to be the exacta of Muth over Imagination. The 4/9, the Baffert double is going to be a popular play. And I can tell you why, because Muth is going to be the inside early speed here. He's breaking out of the 4. The horses inside of Muth are not necessarily inclined to take the lead, which means Muth is going to be on the rail and he's going to dictate this race from wire to wire. Imagination likely to go with him. He will be either on the outside of Muth or on the outside of another early speed horse like Mystik Dan. But ultimately, being able to hang on to Muth and run second is the likely expectation here for Bob Baffert attempting to go 1-2 at Preakness. Imagination not going to be on the top of my ticket. I don't think he has the quality to beat Muth. But if this is a Bob Baffert race in terms of controlling the pace and ultimately dictating the winner, then Imagination has got to be under Muth on all of your cards.